Hello, and welcome to day 2 of my 30-day Talk to the Camera challenge. Today's topic is discuss a book or article that you've read. And so I have a book in mind for you. Again, the challenge that I'm using is the 30-day camera challenge by Sarah Jolie, which I will leave linked down below, as well as the other one I mentioned in the last video, which is a more in-depth one by Bevan's Bench. And those will be linked in the description. And as I said in the last video, if you would like to get the modified copies I did on Word to kind of simplify them and make them easier to read or print, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I will create a Google Drive that I can link to so that way you can download to either follow along or try it yourself. So let's get to the book. All right, so this is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I can never really say his name right. I think it's Kahneman. This book has a little bit of a story. I would say that this book is really kind of what started my education journey into psychology. When I got out of the military, roughly a little over 10 years ago, and I started school second time for my computer engineering degree about 10 years ago, which I didn't finish, my physics professor recommended this book, and I found it incredibly fascinating in terms of really helping to understand how it is that we operate. So the book kind of bases a lot of its ideas on this idea of two systems of thinking, which is typically commonly known in psychology in a number of ways. The way the book describes it is you have your system 1 of thinking, which is your most commonly used thinking system. This is your automatic way of thinking, also known as your heuristical thinking. It could also be considered, in my opinion, your unconscious way of thinking. And then you have your system 2, which is more your focused, analytical. It's kind of your more attentive or attention way of thinking, where you're using more of that prefrontal cortex in your brain to work through problems or kind of analyze what's going on. This is typically used a lot, especially if you're doing very analytical type of stuff, such as mathematics and calculations, right? Things that require you to consciously work through a problem versus automatically having a response based on something like prior experience or muscle memory. So that is essentially the gist of the book, and it covers a lot of different aspects. One thing it also covers is this idea of behavioral economics. And behavioral economics, there's another book I have back there by Richard Thaler, who also worked with Daniel Kahneman, and Amos Tversky. I hope I'm saying that name right. And Amos and Daniel were best friends, and so a lot of the stuff that you will read in this book, which I highly recommend getting, it is something that for me not only put me on the on this kind of course of my education, but it really kind of opened up this idea of not just how people kind of operate, but also how I personally operate. It makes you kind of think about your unconscious processes more, things like your biases that could be influencing your choices and the way you think. And so this, along with a few other books, which if you're interested, I'll probably end up sharing them anyways, because I have quite a few behind me. In fact, I'm actually running out of shelf space. But anyways, Amos and Daniel were best friends, and they also worked with Richard Thaler, who was kind of developing this idea of behavioral economics. Economics or pure economics is kind of a different area of study where they try to understand, I guess theoretically, like they call them pure econs, like what sort of economic choices people would make. And a lot of times what Daniel and Amos and Richard all found was that people don't always make logical choices. Like sometimes they would make very different choices based on how the question was framed, such as like if you were to, you have a chance of losing like $200 out of 500, or you can lose nothing out of 300 or something like that. I'll have to, one of these days when I'm actually take more time to like flesh out like a full video, like have something outlined and detailed where I can really explain these concepts. Right now, that is not the focus of these videos, but I'd really like to kind of go into detail on those things. But yeah, it's kind of opened a lot to me, and definitely a recommended read. In terms of like this idea of like unconscious and conscious processing, I think that's really what this book kind of drives home. So again, your fast thinking system is typically your unconscious processing, because that is the most efficient way our brains operate. Like, I don't know if you've tried to sit there and go through like a series of math problems that your teacher gave you, and by the end of it, your brain is just fried. Or if you're like reading something like, this, which, if you're doing exercise long, that it requires active thinking, you're not relying as much on the unconscious processing. And after just like a few hours, your brain is just like toasted, and you want to go and start watching YouTube videos or scroll through Facebook because you just cannot think anymore. And that is because when we use our slow method of thinking, when we use our prefrontal cortex that requires so much more energy than our unconscious processes, which are very much automatic and learned, right? It's the things you've already learned in life. And so, it talks about a few things like the heuristics. Heuristics, again, are our biases, and our biases are essentially these learned beliefs that we have about our worldview and how we see the world around us. And like a good example they talk about kind of in the book and in some other places is like you have your representative heuristic, and your representative heuristic is when you see something, you think that it equates to something else. So for example, if you were to see, say, like a redheaded woman in a very conservative outfit, maybe a white blouse and like a long brown skirt wearing glasses, you would probably think she's a librarian. And she may be like an accountant or a lawyer, or she may be none of those things. If you saw someone who looked like a just leather-clad biker with tattoos and everything, you would think that person might be like an outlaw and a troublemaker or something like that. But that person might actually be like a loving father and an accountant, or even that I've seen people like that who are lawyers, right? So it's like your representative heuristic is kind of this like, what would you call it? Like your assumption on what you think someone is based on appearances alone. Kind of goes back to that saying, don't read a book by its cover, or you don't know anything about anyone just based on the things you see. The other heuristic is the availability heuristic, and this is one I think a lot is very commonplace today, especially with social media. And the availability heuristic is essentially, it's the thing that is most available in your mind or that you see, you feel is very common, even if it's not. So an example would be you're watching the news and you see this video about a plane crash, and it's all over every station. You go on Facebook or you go on Instagram, and there's all these things and talking about, how dangerous plane crashes are or whatever, or like some investigation that's going on. And because you see these things, you feel like, there's a problem, because you think that plane crashes are common when they're actually less common and cause less death than, say, car crashes, which are even more common. You don't hear of that often. So your fear of getting on like an airplane because you're afraid it's going to crash because you see these news reports is kind of unfounded. I mean, valid fear, right? Kind of go into like counselor mode here, right? Like that fear is valid, but it's not based on any sort of rational thing. It's based on this availability heuristic where you see something, you think it's incredibly likely when it's not. And because we don't hear about car crashes all the time, we don't think of them as being as common or as dangerous, and so everyone's fine with getting in a car, even though you have a greater chance of dying in a car crash or you have a greater chance of getting in a car accident than you would get into a plane crash. So this book kind of covers, again, a lot of those like ideas and concepts, not really with those specific examples. Maybe some of them might be in there, but I feel like it's a really good book. The one thing I will warn you is that it does use a lot of psychology terms, but if I remember correctly, the last time I read it, it does a good job of explaining what these terms are and what they mean, rather than just regurgitating them and expecting the reader to understand. And it does cover a lot in terms of the experiments they've ran, the data, like they kind of go over the data, but it's not like a bunch of plots and bar graphs and charts and things. They just kind of show like, hey, this percentage of this many people, chose this option versus this option. And then when we changed it around, the percentages changed from this to this, which indicated that, even though the idea would have been they would have selected the same answer, selected something different. So it doesn't kind of force, like if you've ever read a research article, like an APA article or anything like that, like especially in, the psychology realm or any other research realm, how they usually show a lot of these plots and graphs, and they have these different values like p-values. You don't have that as much in this book. And it's a New York Times bestseller, so that means a lot of people must have read it. So that must make it that it's easily digestible. It is a bit big, but this is, again, like I said, one of my favorite books. Very impactful, very insightful, and I think some of you might enjoy it. So that's the video. Like I said, I can link the challenges that the challenge I'm using plus the other one down below. And as I said, if you want to see me upload this, if you also have any questions, right, either about the book or anything else, I know this is kind of early. This is only second video for this channel, completely new one. But yeah, and if you'd be interested in hearing about more of the books, like I said, I'm probably going to do them anyways at some point when I need to have more stuff to talk about, and hopefully kind of go into more structured detail versus this kind of off-the-cuff podcast style. Again, the goal of this is mainly this interaction here, but yeah, hope everyone has a great day. If you like the video, go ahead and hit like. If you'd like to follow along and join me on the journey, please subscribe and hit the bell notification so that way you know when the next one drops, which will, for the next month, be just about every day. So maybe unnecessary, but yeah. But with that, I am out, and everyone have a wonderful day. And since we're coming up on the 4th of July, if you see this before the 4th, happy 4th of July. I'm sure I will say that again when the day comes. All right, everyone. Have a good one. Peace.